Hi, I'm Aneesa Abbas Higgins, and I'm going to read to you today from my translation of A Girl Called Eel by Ali Zamir, which was published last year by Jacaranda, and it received an English Pen Award. The book was first published in France in 2016, and it was Ali Zamir's first novel. Ali Zamir is from the Comoros Islands, which is where the novel takes place, and it begins as the narrator, Eel herself, is facing what looks like certain death, drowning at sea in a boat, a small boat called a kwasa, trying to cross from the island of Anjouan to the island of Mayotte. And as she flounders in the raging waters, her life flashes before her. So I'm going to read to you a section that explains how she came to be called Eel and how she came into the world. A Girl Called Eel by Ali Zamir. When our mother fell pregnant, my father, all-knowing, had already decided on my name. He hadn't yet picked Rattler, as he didn't know my mother was expecting twins. It was just the name Eel that had lodged in his brain. The eel is a ubiquitous species, he'd inform us. Eels are smart, very much in demand, the envy of all other fish. And he'd tell us that the day he conceived the idea, he dashed home quick as a flash and announced to Mum that the baby would be called Eel. Boy or girl, Eel is what it'll be. And because my mother obviously hadn't understood what he was on about, he'd expanded on this and said, I intend to make a difference. I want my child to be an example for the next generation, a child who can stand up for themselves, make their mark on the world, a child whose every pronouncement will enlighten the ignorant. God, he was full of himself. He really did think he could change the world. My mother had no choice, in the end, but to resign herself to this scheme of his. She simply didn't know what to say. She just sat there, dumbfounded and defeated. On the day we were born, a torrential rainstorm fell on the town, and with my mother in the throes of agonizing labour pains, our father, all-knowing, decided to take himself off to the market to buy some medicinal herbs, leaving our mother with her sister Tranquil to attend to the birth. The downpour didn't let up at all, and our father was held up and didn't come back for a couple of hours. By the time he eventually arrived, he was soaked to the skin. He opened the front door and stood there on the threshold, shaking from the cold, dumbstruck by the sight that greeted him. For most of the neighbours were there, old men and women, teenagers, and even children, poking their noses in, curious to see what their parents and grandparents were doing in our house. All-knowing was rendered speechless when he saw this gathering of people, all dressed in their boo-boos, with their skull-caps and headscarves, clutching their worry beads. And when they glimpsed all-knowing standing there, they immediately moved aside for him, eyes cast down, as if they were ashamed of themselves, like schoolchildren caught in the act by their teacher, trying not to look guilty in an effort to avoid being punished. And when they suddenly fell silent, all-knowing wondered what was going on. He wondered why and stepped over the threshold, still trying to work out what was going on. The silence weighed on him as he walked across the courtyard and gazed at those bowed heads, the figures standing still as statues, when suddenly he heard the cry of a newborn ringing out from the room at the back. He approached it cautiously and stepped into that tiny room that was later to become our bedroom, and beheld Aunt Tranquil sitting there in silence, her head bowed, holding two babies in her arms. And still all-knowing didn't understand. He was simply happy to learn that he was the father of two, but he was troubled by the attitude of that strange crowd, and most of all by Tranquil. Why wasn't she happy? Why didn't she look up to see who'd walked in the room? And then all-knowing couldn't stop himself. He burst into tears, even though he still didn't understand what had happened. He'd walked, nonplussed, into that room where he'd left my mother before he went out. But then he saw Mum's body on the bed, wrapped in a white shroud, and he uttered one long cry. In that split second, he was ripped from his moorings and saw his whole life crumbling around him. And as the tears streamed down his face, Tranquil sat there, stock still, not uttering a word, not even moving her arms to rock the infants cradled in them, their innocent cries the only signs of life in that house. And as he gazed at his sister-in-law, All-Knowing sobbed his heart out. For death can strike like a sword, shattering one rock to build another from the pieces. And this was one of those times. The game of life goes on. The baton is always there, waiting to be passed. You won't understand what I mean by this unless you follow me to the end of this tale, if there is indeed an end. Death is an enigma, and when it strikes, it can rob a living being of the power of speech. It weighs like a heavy burden on that person, even on the most happy-go-lucky of souls. It makes no sense at all.